You already know the story. You were taught it in school, you've seen it in cartoons. You've seen it in the illustration that shows a hunched, hairy, slack-jawed creature slowly straightening up and becoming a man in a suit. Neanderthals were the rough draft. We were the final version. They were strong but stupid. We were clever, and cleverness won. They lost. We stayed. End of story. Here is the problem with that story. Every single assumption inside it has now failed a test. Not one, not most. All of them. The idea that they were less intelligent, tested, failed. The idea that we wiped them out, tested, no evidence. The idea that their genes had rotted from inbreeding until they collapsed, tested in 2026 on 27 of the last Neanderthals in Europe, and the data said no. And the moment you remove those explanations, you are left staring at something far more unsettling than a defeat. Because the deeper the evidence goes, the more it looks like the Neanderthals didn't lose a war at all. It looks like they were quietly, unremarkably, over thousands of years, absorbed. And the traces of that absorption are inside your body right now. Let's start with the part that's easiest to prove wrong, the idea that they were primitive. In central Germany, at a site called Neumarkt Nord, archaeologists excavated a lakeshore that Neanderthals used 125,000 years ago. What they found there was not a campfire and some gnawed bones. They found the remains of at least 172 large animals, horses, deer, aurochs, big cats, and extinct rhinoceros, alongside more than 100,000 bone fragments and around 16,000 flint tools. The bones had been deliberately smashed into tiny pieces, then heated in water. This is a technique called grease rendering. You pulverize fat-rich bone, boil it for hours, and skim the fat off the surface as it cools. It produces a dense, portable, storable, high-calorie food. It also protects you from a condition called protein poisoning, which kills hunters who eat too much lean meat and not enough fat. To do this, you have to hunt animals you don't need yet. You have to transport carcasses across a landscape to a specific location chosen for this task. You have to invest enormous labor up front for a reward that arrives days later. That is planning. That is delayed gratification. That is a supply chain. Before this discovery, archaeologists believe this behavior first appeared with modern humans in the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 28,000 years ago. Neanderthals were doing it nearly 100,000 years earlier. And that is one site. Elsewhere, Neanderthals were producing birch bark tar, a synthetic adhesive that requires heating bark in a low-oxygen environment at a controlled temperature, a process you cannot stumble into by accident. 200,000 years ago, their average brain volume was equal to ours, in many specimens larger. They survived multiple glacial cycles in a European climate that would kill an unequipped modern person in a single night. These were not the losers of prehistory. They were the incumbents. They had held Eurasia for roughly 300,000 years before we ever walked into it. So what actually happened at the end? The first thing to understand is that there was no end in the sense we imagine. There was no final battle, no massacre layer in the sediment, no site anywhere in Europe showing Neanderthals killed by modern humans. What the dating shows instead is a long, slow, overlapping fade. The best current chronologies place the disappearance of Neanderthals somewhere between 40,000 and 37,000 years ago, which means that after modern humans arrived in Europe, the two populations shared the continent for a minimum of 4,000 to 5,000 years. Sit with that number. 5,000 years is longer than the entire span from the building of the pyramids to now. At Grotte Mandrine, a rock shelter overlooking the Rhone Valley in southern France, the same cave was occupied by modern humans and by Neanderthals at different points in time. The only known site in the world where the two alternated in the same shelter. This was not an invasion. This was a shared continent for millennia. And during those millennia, something specific happened. Something we can now date almost to the century. Around 1 to 2% of the genome of every person alive today with ancestry outside Africa is Neanderthal. That has been known since 2010. What was not known was when it entered. In December 2024, two independent teams answered that question, one by sequencing the oldest modern human DNA ever recovered, from remains at Ranis in Germany and Zlatý Kun in Czechia, and one by analyzing 58 ancient Eurasian genomes against hundreds of living ones. Both landed in the same place, a single extended period of interbreeding centered around 47,000 years ago, lasting roughly 7,000 years. Now line those two timelines up against each other. The interbreeding runs from roughly 50,000 to 43,000 years ago. The Neanderthals disappear from the record around 40,000 years ago. The period of mixing does not precede their disappearance. It runs directly into it. The genetic exchange stops at almost exactly the moment they stop existing as a separate people. That is the first clue that we are looking at the wrong kind of event. The second clue arrived in 2026, and it demolished the most popular remaining explanation. For years, the leading theory was genetic collapse. Neanderthal populations were small, scattered and inbred, their genomes accumulating harmful mutations until they simply weren't viable anymore. It was a tidy story. Then a team led by Alba Bossoms Mesa at the Max Planck Institute retrieved high-resolution genetic data from 27 Neanderthal individuals from the Meuse Basin in Belgium and 2 sites in France. Some of the very last Neanderthals in northwestern Europe, several of them fossils that had been sitting in museum drawers since the 19th century. The result contradicted the theory outright. These populations showed no evidence of increasing genetic load, no sign of shrinking diversity over time, and low levels of inbreeding. They were not a dying lineage limping toward the exit. They were a connected, genetically healthy regional population, right up until they weren't there anymore. But buried in that same study is the strangest finding in this entire field. These Neanderthals lived alongside modern humans in the same region for what may have been as many as 500 generations. We have modern human remains from that era whose Neanderthal ancestry is so recent you can identify it in the family tree. Individuals whose great-great-great-grandparent was a Neanderthal. And going the other way? Nothing. Not one confirmed Neanderthal individual has ever been found with a recent modern human ancestor. The gene flow, at the level of individual families, appears to run one way. Neanderthal DNA moves into the modern human population and stays there. Modern human DNA does not appear to be moving back into Neanderthal communities in the same way, in the same period. Whatever the mechanism turns out to be, and researchers are actively arguing about it, including a 2026 study proposing that pairings were heavily sex-biased, a claim other geneticists have publicly challenged, the pattern itself is the point. This is not what a war looks like. It is what a merger looks like. One population is drawing individuals out of the other, generation after generation, and not returning them. Then there is Thorin. In 2015, in that same cave in the Rhone Valley, archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal man who lived close to the very end, around 42,000 years ago. They named him Thorin, after Tolkien's dwarf king, the last of his line. When his genome was sequenced in 2024, it revealed something nobody expected. Thorin's lineage had split from the main European Neanderthal population around 100,000 years ago, and had then spent roughly 50,000 years without exchanging a single gene with any other Neanderthal group. 50,000 years of total isolation, and here is the detail that stops researchers cold. He was not isolated by an ocean, or a mountain range, or an ice sheet. Other Neanderthal populations were living roughly 10 days' walk away. 2 branches of the same species within walking distance for 50 millennia, and they never mixed. That is not a species being defeated. That is a species that had stopped functioning as a network. Which brings us to what may be the closest thing we have to an answer. In 2026, a team led by Ariane Burke at the Université de Montréal took modeling tools normally used to map the ranges of plants and animals and applied them to Europe between 60,000 and 35,000 years ago, using archaeological sites as data points for where each species could actually live. They weren't asking who was smarter, they were asking who was connected. The results were consistent. The territories suitable for modern humans were more interconnected than those used by Neanderthals. Neanderthals had links between groups. The movement of stone and materials across regions proves it. But those links were weaker and more regionally limited, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. That connectivity, Burke argues, functioned as a safety net. Linked populations can exchange information about where the animals are moving. They can form partnerships. They can borrow territory during a bad season. They can send people to a group that has too few and receive people from a group that has too many. The study also found that what stressed these populations most was not cold. It was volatility. How fast and unpredictably conditions changed. And Neanderthals had already proven they could survive brutal cold. They had done it repeatedly for hundreds of thousands of years. What they had not faced before was a period of violent instability, while their own social fabric was fragmented into isolated pockets like Thorin's. And then the arithmetic finishes the job. In late 2025, researchers published a model in Scientific Reports testing whether interbreeding alone, no violence, no competition, no catastrophe, could erase Neanderthals as a distinct people. It could, with small waves of modern human immigration arriving every 50 to 150 years. A population that starts 100% Neanderthal becomes more than 99% modern human in 10 to 30,000 years. That is not extinction. That is dilution. And the timeline fits what we already see in the ground. So here is where the evidence actually leaves us. A people who were not weak, who invented food processing techniques we credited to ourselves for a century, who held a continent for 300,000 years, and who were still genetically healthy at the end. They didn't lose a fight. They were fragmented, they were outnumbered, and they were folded, slowly, generation by generation, one marriage at a time, into a population that was better connected than they were. The lesson is not that we were superior. It's that survival was never really about strength or even intelligence. It was about who was tied to whom. Neanderthals were not defeated by better brains. They were outlasted by a bigger network. And they are not gone. Every person watching this with ancestry outside Africa carries their DNA. No individual carries much, 1 or 2%, but every individual carries a slightly different 1 or 2%. Add all of us together, and a large fraction of the Neanderthal genome is still here, distributed in fragments across billions of living bodies. They didn't vanish from the earth. They just stopped being a separate story and started being part of yours.